First Sunday of the new year, excited to worship together today and just excited about what the Lord's going to do. Lots of announcements. I'll let you take the time to go through all of them. They're in the bulletin. I know we had a couple new classes get started this morning, one for ladies, and Dr. Logan started one as well. If you don't have a Bible study that you attend at 9 a.m. on Sunday mornings, we'd love for you to come and be a part of those two or any of the other classes that we offer. They're all great, and we'd love to have you come worship with us. I do want to say a special thank you again to just you for your generosity. We'll speak more about this in a few moments, but you're just a generous folk, and I'm just looking forward to serving together in the new year with you, all right? If you're a guest among us this morning, just glad you're here worshiping with us. If this is your first time with us today, hopefully you received a welcome bag on your way in the door. Inside that welcome bag is some information about our church as well as a small gift, a token of our appreciation for coming. And then there's also a visitor's card. If you take just a couple of moments and fill that out, drop it in the offering bag so that we could have record you were here with us today, we would greatly appreciate it. And who knows, you might get some chocolate chip cookies dropped off at your door. You just never know. So take some time and fill that out for us. We also have several services going on this morning for your convenience. Out this main door and to the left is our nursery area for 0 to 5. So if you have any kids that are 0 to 5, we'd welcome you to check them in over there at the check-in station. We'll keep them nice and safe and secure, and you can drop them off and pick them back up after services are over. Or we also have children's church for kindergarten up to 5th grade if you so desire. And if you still go out the same door and to the left and then take a right down the long hallway into our student life facility, there in the gymnasium we'll be having our children's church. And again, there's some security over there that will check them in, and you're welcome to drop them off and pick them up after church, all right? And most importantly this morning, how about them Cowboys, right? No, all right. I was glad to see that there's like 7 of us in this church, right? And listen, we have like 3 playoff wins in 25 years. So when we get one, we have to celebrate. And the best way to celebrate that is to come to church and ask for forgiveness for all of our sins. Amen? Oh, I'm sorry. I got that mixed up with the Chiefs fans. Come on in, Matt. This morning we're going to start off our services today and the new year with a baptism, the same way we ended our services last year. What a great way to end a year and begin a new year, right? I want to introduce you to my friend here, Matt. Matt and I have been golfing buddies and everything else over the years, and he and his lovely bride, Beth, come to church here, members, and they've got a couple of kids with a couple more on the way. Hope that wasn't a secret, but they're having twins, so they're on the way. So going from 4 to 6, God bless you. So excited about that, and for them, excited about that. And Matt called me a couple months ago, texted me a couple months ago and said, hey, when can we meet? And we set up a time to sit down in the office and chat. And not that I had any reservations about that, but you just always don't know what somebody has on their heart and mind when they want to meet. And we sat down in my office and shut the door, and just one of the most sincere statements I've ever heard. He said, the old Matt has to go away, and there has to be a new Matt. And we started talking a little bit about that, and that day he prayed to receive Christ and trusted in him for the forgiveness of sins, and I'm excited about that and just the privilege that it is to be a part of the gospel work and watch it work in Matt. And one of his theme verses during this time has come out of Matthew chapter 19 and verse 26, and just for context, in that chapter, Jesus is discussing how hard it is for a person to be saved, and he tells the story, or they tell the story, the gospel writer does, of a rich man who came to Jesus and wanted to enter into the kingdom of God, and he asked what it would require, and Jesus said, go and sell everything, get rid of everything, in other words, make him premier, make him fundamental, make him the pinnacle, the cornerstone upon which everything else is built, give it all away to the poor, and you come follow me. And the gospel writer concludes, the man went away sorrowful because he had great possessions. He determined in that moment that it wasn't worth it to lose everything else to gain Christ. And after that, the disciples asked a question. They said, who could be saved? This seems really difficult. Who could be saved? And verse 26 says, with man, these things aren't possible, but with God, all things are possible. And so with that, based upon your profession of faith, I want to baptize you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, buried with him in death, raised to walk in newness of life. If you have your Bibles with you this morning, let's turn to 1 Samuel and chapter number 25. 1 Samuel and chapter number 25, or if you want to turn there in your app or smartphone. I forget I'm speaking to a young audience, but 1 Samuel and chapter 25, we're going to speak on the subject matter this morning of Beauty and the Beast, the story of beauty, discernment, and a hot temper. Now, we can relate to some of that, right? Beauty and the Beast, the story of beauty, discernment, and a hot temper. We're going to officially kick off our new series this morning, Untold, Lives That Mattered That Nobody Ever Told You About. And we're going to begin our series by looking at a story of a woman by the name of Abigail. You've heard the story, undoubtedly, of Beauty and the Beast, especially if you have kids. You probably have it on DVD, VHS, MP3, or something else, right? And for those reasons, I sat down with Miss Zariah the other night, and I asked her to fill me in on what I might have forgotten over the years and what that story looked like. And she reminded me that the story of Beauty and the Beast, as put out there by Disney, is the story of a beautiful princess by the name of Belle. And Belle is taken captive by a terrible, terrible beast. The beast was once a handsome prince, Zariah said, but he was vain, and so a witch cast a spell on him to look on the outside as he was on the inside. Okay, maybe she didn't put it in all of those words, but that's basically what she told me, right? And the rest of the movie, as follows, is singing china, pushy clocks, and an obnoxious, annoying talking candle that seems to not leave anybody alone, right? And then there is, as Paul Harvey would say, the rest of the story. And so without copyright infringement, we look at the real story this morning of Beauty and the Beast, a woman by the name of Abigail, and her beastly husband, a man by the name of Nabal. Our story begins at the end of verse number 1 there in chapter number 25, and it's following the death of a prophet by the name of Samuel. David, who had been appointed, who had been anointed by Samuel, by God, by way of Samuel, to be the new king of Israel, David is seemingly fleeing in this moment away from Saul, and word has gotten out that Samuel, the prophet, has died, and David finds his way into the wilderness of Paran, and he stumbles upon the land of a man by the name of Nabal. The writer tells us in verse number 2 that Nabal was a wealthy man. How wealthy, you asked? I'm glad you asked. He has 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. That's a lot of money, right? Or at least it's a lot of clothes to give away at Christmas time. But his greatest wealth, the writer's going to go on to show us, is not those things, but rather there in verse number 2, we're told, or verse number 3, his greatest wealth is a woman by the name of Abigail, a woman who is described as discerning and beautiful. Her name, Abigail, means, by the way, joy of her father. It probably speaks, by the way, of her countenance. And many times in the Old Testament, a name was attributed to an individual as to what they wanted to be, who they should be, or a reflection as to who they really were. A parent would name their child, and that name would shape their existence. So Abigail apparently was a blessing to her parents, and her countenance was such that the writer says she was beautiful and discerning. Not only was she beautiful on the outside, but the appearance here is that she was apparently a beautiful person in her soul on the inside. And we're going to see that played out as her story goes on. But verse number 3 also tells us about the beast, the man by the name of Nabal and her husband and what his countenance was like. In fact, I like how the writer says it. He says of Nabal that he was harsh and badly behaved. Every spouse look at their husband and say, that sounds like you. Harsh and badly behaved. Now eat some candy and listen to the preacher or wake up, whatever the words are appropriate, right? By contrast to the beauty and the elegance of Abigail, the writer tells us that Nabal was completely the opposite. He's known around town as a troublemaker. The word harsh there in the Hebrew speaks of his stinginess, his selfishness. That is, that Nabal was always looking out for himself. He was always making sure that Nabal got his due. Nabal was always getting what he was owed in life. His name means fool. So one can see a picture that begins to develop around Nabal, and we'll see it as the story unfolds, that as his life develops, Nabal is everything that Abigail is not. The two stand in complete contrast to each other, right? In fact, every time I say Nabal this morning, I want wives to turn to your husband and say, I pity the fool, right? That's Nabal. He is a fool. He's selfish. He's self-absorbed. He's always about himself, while Abigail stands as a class act of beauty and discernment. Now, the curious part to me is how the two of them ever came together in the first place. You ever wonder that? Sure you do, right? How could a man like Nabal, such a foolish fella, ever get such a beautiful, discerning, wonderful wife like Abigail? Well, it's pure conjecture on my part this morning because the Bible doesn't really tell us. But I wonder if Nabal maybe one day looked out and he saw Abigail in all of her beauty, and he thought to himself, I've got to have that girl. And since marriages in their day were arranged by the parents, I wonder if Nabal didn't use some of his resources and some of his selfishness and some of his conjuring abilities, as it were, to convince her parents to say, okay, this seems like a good provider, and we'll send her with you. Whatever the case was, however they came together, they appear in our story as Beauty Abigail and the Beast Nabal. Two polar opposite personalities in every way. Two polar opposite views of the world. Two polar opposite responses to the future king of Israel by the name of David. To add another layer to the story, the introduction of these characters comes at a critical moment in the life of this future king by the name of David. We know he would become the greatest king of Israel, but he's not there yet here in 1 Samuel chapter 25. He is, in fact, at this moment on the run from the present king of Israel by the name of Saul. Saul was the first king of Israel, but he knows that his time is running short. He has failed God, and the prophet Samuel, who has just passed away, has already appointed the successor, has already affirmed, anointed, and told Saul what God was going to do, that he was going to replace him with a new king who would rule and reign for all of eternity, whose seed would continually, forevermore, be on the throne of Israel. The prophet Samuel had already spoken about this David, and that David would be replacing Saul. And instead of Saul taking the approach of saying, well, if you can't beat him, join him, or saying to himself, I'll use this David. After all, David had proved himself reliable. Think back about the accolades of David defeating a giant by the name of Goliath. Saul might have said, you know what, I don't care if he's my successor. I'm going to plug him in and use him. Instead, Saul is pursuing David in this moment in an effort to try to kill him. That's how we find David in the story. He's running away. And while he's running away, he has found his way in his retreat onto Nabal's land. And one day, according to verse number 4, David hears that Nabal is out shearing his sheep. So David, verse 5, sends 10 of his young men to go and to have a conversation with Nabal. Remember? I pity the fool. David sends 10 of his young men to go and have a conversation with a fool. The conversation's supposed to be an easy one. First of all, he says, I want you to go, and when you arrive and see Nabal, I want you to tell him who I am and who has sent you. David, the one anointed by the prophet Samuel to ascend to the throne of Israel, the slayer of giants, the victorious general, that's the one, Nabal, who has sent us. That's what David says. Nabal should know who David is at that point. Something we'll return to in a few moments, but everybody in Israel knows who David is. And so David says, young men, go and see Nabal, but tell him first who has sent you. Second thing he tells them is, in this conversation, we want you to tell Nabal that we have come in peace. Verse number 6. That is, that we mean no harm to you. We're not here to conquer. We're not here to overrun you. We're not here to steal your possessions. We have come in peace. You have no reason to fear us. Third part of the conversation, tell him that what we have done for him and his shepherds while they were out in the wilderness, where we have been staying with them in verse number 7, and we have protected your herds and your men. We have taken nothing that was ours. We have even protected them and your herds. Again, that's a point we'll return to later that's emphasized in verse number 15 when Abigail is told about David's men. That is, that David's men apparently had been spending time with Nabal's servants who were out tending his flocks, and during that time, David and his men had taken it upon themselves to protect Nabal and all of his riches, all of his wealth, all of his herds. They had taken it upon themselves to risk their own lives to protect this. And because of this, verse number 8, David says, I want you to ask Nabal in this conversation if he would be so gracious as to share some of the meat with us that we have protected because we are hungry. Now, that story, if we stop there, doesn't really seem like that much to us. Nabal would even seem to have every right to refuse service, right? I mean, after all, this is Nabal's property, right? That doesn't make him foolish for thinking such. It's his possessions, it's his bank account, it's his field, it's his sheep, it's his shepherds, right? He has no obligation to pay David anything at all, even if David has been good to him. Even if David is right in that he sent his men are trespassing on his property. He has every right to refuse them. And even if everything that David has said is right, and even if they have protected against lion and bear and foreign marauders and everything else, even if all of that is true, David, you have no right to demand I do anything for you. So David says, I want you to do it. Nabal, you have a choice. But there's more to the story than just that. You see, in their world, David is showing great restraint. He has stolen nothing. He's conquered nothing. Quite the opposite of what might have typically have happened. You see, in their world, if you walked into a field and you saw something and you wanted it, if you had superior power and force, then you took it. By the time of Jesus, shepherds were known by their ruthlessness, by their mean-spiritedness, by their willingness to be even thieves. That's why it's so amazing in the gospel accounts that these shepherds are the first to hear about the coming of the Messiah, the Christ, the child born in a manger. It's Luke's way of telling us that the gospel was going to be opened up even to the most vile of offenders. A shepherd's responsibility was watch over his flock. And, well, if he lost a sheep along the way, the best thing he could do is walk into another field and take somebody else's sheep. Now, you have the future king of Israel with some 600 men. He could overrun anybody he wanted to. And in fact, in their day, the way you built a kingdom was exactly by doing that. Go from place to place, land to land, house to house, conquer, building your coalition and support. And if you couldn't get them to support you, then you wiped them off the face of the earth. But David says, I didn't do any of that to you, Nabal. I sent my men and they protected you. I've showed great restraint. We've not touched anything. In fact, if you were to go out and check the numbers on the ear tags, you would find that we didn't take one thing the entire time we were there helping you, right? And Nabal, he should have desired to garner some favor with David as well. If you think about just not only the fact that David had showed restraint, now think about the fact that Nabal, having heard of David, must know that this guy is going to ascend to the throne. Nabal might say, well, I've got allegiance to Saul, but if he's a smart man, which we might assume that he was in some ways, he might have looked and said, well, you know this David fellow that everybody keeps talking about? Well, he's conquered giants and he's won military battles. It really wouldn't be that much for him to conquer Saul. And I heard a story about a prophet who anointed him as the future king. Maybe this is a moment to rise up and to bestow some honor. Nabal could have said, you know, I think if I would do this, what are you going to do for me, David? And would it not be wise for Nabal to garner some favor in such a moment like that? To say, you know what, this guy, he's going to be the future king. I might want to help him. This is just a small little request. Lots of reasons why Nabal should have seceded in this request. But apparently Nabal thought differently. Beginning in verse number 10, Nabal rejects David's men. He starts off by saying, who is David and who is the son of Jesse? But his questions are not sincere. He's not really sitting there in that moment not knowing who David was. Quite the opposite. His rejection of David in this moment is purely motivated by greed. That's confirmed later in verse number 28 as the story goes on by his wife by the name of Abigail. Nabal knew who David was in this moment. He wasn't being sincere and saying, I don't know who you are. He just simply wanted to be a contrarian. And you can really hear that in his disdain at the end of verse 10 when he says, there are many servants these days who are breaking away from their masters. It's a poetic way for Nabal to say of David in that moment that you are nothing more than a menace to the kingdom, a rouser, a troublemaker. Leave me alone. Nabal's response to David is, I don't know who you think you are. I don't know who you think you come from. I've never heard of your father. I don't care what a prophet said about you. I don't care what you think you're going to eventually become. What I know is there are a lot of people causing problems for the kingdom, and it seems to me like you're one of them. I'm not giving you nothing. Nabal sends him away in verse number 11, making it clear that he has no intention of meeting that small request. It's short-sighted on his part, isn't it? He has a chance to be a part of David's story in a good way, to support the future king of Israel, but he determines in this moment that his wealth was far more important to himself than it was to share with the future king of Israel. Now, this is where the story takes a turn and gets funny. This is why I like Old Testament stories. This is why I like stories in general, because normally there are turning points where things begin to happen. Next week, I'm going to preach on the Weight Watcher that got whacked, or when Jenny Craig doesn't work, right? And there's always these funny stories in people's lives that catch you by surprise. Here's the funny part about what happens next. In verse number 12, David's men leave this conversation. And they return with Nabal's response to David, basically saying, this guy wouldn't give us any time of day. He wouldn't listen to us. Now, what would you have done if you had sent your men and they had returned with that response? Well, you and I, being reasonable people, or at least you might have said, well, you win some and you lose some, right? Now, I know next time not to protect Nabal's flock. I know next time not to stick myself out there so far. Or we might have said, that's the last time I help a brother out, right? I mean, every time I do something good, it always comes around to bite me in the place that you're not allowed to say from a Baptist pulpit. But David's response is fanatical. When the men come back and they say, hey, this guy won't give us the time of day, verse 13, David says, every man strap on his sword. David says, hey, let's go to war against this guy, right? I mean, think about that for a moment, folks. David sends his men to talk to Nabal. Simple request. Would you give us a little bit of meat? We're hungry. We're tired. We've been out there serving your people without anything for no real reason other than it was the right thing to do. Nabal says, I don't care if it was the right thing. I didn't ask you to do it. Go on your way. I don't want nothing to do with you. And David's response to that is, well, if you want to play that way, I'll just have my men load up their swords. We are going to war, men. Why? So they might have asked. We aren't going to war over weapons of mass destruction. We're not going to war over kingdom sovereignty. We aren't going to war even over a moral cause. No, we are going to war because this fella, are you ready, offended me. David's response is, this guy offended me and I am going to war. That is the overreaction of the century, and that would be putting it mildly. He refused to give me some food. He refused to meet my needs. So you know what? Let's just have it out. Get our dueling pistols out. Count our steps, and on 3, everybody fire, and let's see who's standing. Now, all the ladies in the room, isn't that just like a man, right? I mean, just a small request. He gets turned down. He gets offended. Isn't that just like a man to do something like that? To say, you know what? This is going to be a big deal. In our house, we kind of joke about this sometimes. When it's a really big crisis, I tend to not really react at all. When it's a really small crisis, that's when the world is falling apart. That's in a man's nature to be that way, right? We have this tendency, well, maybe your husbands don't, but I do, okay? We have this tendency to overreact, to take the littlest slight and just make it into something totally ridiculous. On the one side, you have a man who's a fool. On the other side, you have a man who's ready to die over a single night's meal. That's silliness, right? It seems ridiculous. Here's where Abigail begins to shine. She has a choice to make. According to verse number 13, David rounds up about 400 of his men to charge Nabal with victory, which would be assured, right? Because David far outnumbers Nabal, and he's certainly superior in battle. And a little part of me wonders if Abigail in that moment might have thought to herself, you know, let's just see how this plays out. I mean, this is beauty married to the beast. Maybe a little part of Abigail goes, you know, maybe I'll just let David charge and kill my husband. He's a fool. He should have let this happen. Maybe there's a little part of Abigail who says, you know what? Nabal deserves this for all the wrong he's done. After all, if Nabal was anything at home like he was with others, well, you can imagine what it must have been like for Abigail. A small piece of her might have thought, I ought to just let Nabal get what's coming to him. But a nameless young man comes to Abigail in verse 14, and he tells her the story from beginning to end.
He tells her how David's men and their kindness toward her husband and servants. Verse 16, they were a wall to us both by night and by day, and all the while we were with them keeping the sheep. They formed a wall, the servant says. They wouldn't let anybody touch us. They wouldn't let anything touch us. He tells her about the request of David for a little food. And then in verse 17, a linchpin happens. Now therefore know and consider what you should do, the servant says to Abigail. For harm is determined against our master and against all his house, and he is such a worthless man that one cannot speak to him. In other words, the servant comes and he says to Abigail, there's something you need to know. There's been a war brewing between two men, your husband and the future king of Israel. And this war is such a silly war. This war is all about one night's meal, but your husband is a worthless man, and he refuses to even have a conversation about what it would take just to feed David's men for a night. Nobody can talk to him. Nobody can reason with him. It's like a Cowboys fan, right? Nobody can speak good, intelligent facts into them. We just know what we know, right? That's what the servant is saying. Abigail, your husband won't listen to nobody. But then I like how he uses these words. Therefore, you determine what we should do. You consider what should be done. Remember how our story began? Abigail was described in the very first verses as beautiful, and then there was this word discerning. That little word discerning, it speaks of an ability to see past the surface of a situation, to look deep into the foundations, to look deep into what's not highly visible, to be able to look deep into what's going on, and to be able to achieve a successful resolution. The ability to look at a situation and know what's really the driving forces are, and to understand how to lead people in wisdom through it. That's what discernment means. The story began by saying Abigail was such a person. Likewise, the story began by telling us that Nabal was not such a person. And we've seen in David that David is not a discerning person because David wants to go to war over dinner at Colton's, right? I mean, all of this seems so foolish. So the servant says, Abigail, what are you going to do about it? Apparently, Abigail had the ability to dig a little bit deeper than the men around her in her life, to understand the complexity of the world and to make wise decisions. And so her servants ask her to consider what you should do. Discernment, it's a lost trade in our world in 21st century America, isn't it? I was reading an article. I know Pastor Tim posted this on his Twitter feed. I had read it a few days before on my Apple News feed, but there was an article about a young boy. I think he's 11 years old, and he's in foster care in New York. And he is apparently a part of the LGBTQ community, and he has a desire to be a dancing drag star, to be a performing artist in drag. Well, apparently he went to his foster parents recently and asked them to help him in his entrepreneurship, and they booked him to perform at a gay bar where men threw money at him as he took off his clothes and danced seductively on a stage. Now, this act was being celebrated in the article as the beautiful liberation of the LGBT community. We can do whatever we want. Here's the problem. Throw away for a moment the homosexual aspect of the story. How would you feel about that story if I replaced a few pronouns? How would you feel about that story if I told you it was about an 11-year-old girl who went to a strip club and danced and took off her clothes while men threw money at her? Would you feel the same about it? That is a liberation? That is a liberating moment where we are accepting personal responsibility and have the excitement to celebrate such? Absolutely not. Under the umbrella of personal freedom, a little boy has been made the sexual entertainment of men, and a culture claps. A culture says this is wise. This is wisdom. Where are the people of wisdom in 21st century America? Where is our discernment? The servants of Abigail knew they were doomed if they left this thing up to Nabal. They knew that if they left this thing up to the fool, that everything was going to be wrecked. Their house was going to be destroyed. Their livestock that was going to be captured and taken over. They knew that they would probably even have their heads separated from their shoulders, because that's what a conquering king would do. And so the servants went to Abigail, who apparently had shown the distinct trait in her marriage and in her home of discernment and wisdom. The quality to be able to guide in perilous times, to recognize the truth, to look at more than the surface level interpretation of events. They went to her and they said, "What are you going to do about this?" Abigail could have just let it all play out. She could have let Nabal sleep in the bed he'd made and been killed in it, right? Or she could have gone to Nabal and tried to persuade him herself. You know, it's amazing the persuasion that our brides have on us, men, isn't it? Right? Some of you agree with me. It's amazing, right? When nobody else is able to penetrate the heart and to get into our conscience and to have a conversation. She could have said, you know what? The best thing to do would be to go to Nabal and try to persuade him on a different course. Or she could have believed that Nabal would defend any attack. She might have said, you know what? I was stuck by this guy. He may be a beast of a man, but he keeps winning. I'll just see if he happens to win this one. The point is that she had a number of options to choose from. And the choice she would make, beloved, shows just how beautiful and discerning she was. Beginning in verse 18, Abigail puts a plan together. She grabs more than David had requested in provision, and she sends them ahead of her to meet David. Almost like a bribe, but I think it was more than that. She makes a second decision at the end of verse 19 that she tells Nabal nothing. Now think about that, men. We're going to praise that from the pulpit. That his wife said in this moment, you know what? I think the best course of action is to go ahead and pay to get this moving that way, and I'm not going to tell him anything. Now, on the flip side, you might argue, what good would it have done to tell him in the first place, right? Because he's already shown what he's going to do. He's going to do nothing. He's going to let his family get slaughtered over his own vanity. He's going to allow his family to get slaughtered and broken up over his own selfishness. And then the next thing she does is she decides that she's going to ride out and meet David herself. In short, beloved, what she did was she determined what the right path to walk was, given all of the facts, given all of the situation, and she decided to meet David's request with grace. She didn't need anybody's approval or praise. She didn't even care whether anybody knew about her story. She didn't even care whether anybody knew what was about to happen. What she cared about was doing what was right. And she took the matters into her own hands. And she simply went out and did what her husband should have done the first time. But it didn't stop there. Verse 23, we're told, when Abigail saw David, she hurried and she got down from the donkey and she fell before David on her face and she bowed to the ground. That is, that when she saw David, she gave him the respect that her husband should have. When she saw David, she knew in this moment, this is the future king. I will get down on my face as his servant. Even if my own family has failed, I will get down and do this. As a bit of a side note here, I'm thankful for the praying women in my life. I'm thankful for the praying women in my life from the time I was born even till now. For women who just didn't care whether or not somebody knew, or didn't care whether I knew, or they were ever recognized, just took the time to do what was right, who interceded on my behalf, who got before the throne of God and said, I'm going to pray even if nobody else prays. That's a picture of what Abigail is. Listen to what she says in verse 24. She says to David, on me alone, my Lord, be the guilt. Please let your servant speak in your ears and hear the words of your servant. Capture that first phrase. On me alone, my Lord, be the guilt. She says in this moment to David, I know he's an idiot, but listen, put it on me. Blame me. Let me be the one who takes the fall. Don't worry about that. Interestingly, where Nabal wouldn't recognize David's authority, Abigail did. She bowed at his feet. She had done nothing wrong, but she says in this moment, I'll just take all of the blame. And she asked for David's anger to be poured out on her own self. But her discernment wasn't just in those actions. Her finest moment was yet to come. Verse 25. Let not my Lord regard this worthless fellow Nabal. Now that sounds like a wife. I pity the fool. Let not my Lord regard this worthless fellow, Nabal. For as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. She basically tells David that Nabal isn't worth all the trouble. David, you got your army together. You got your 400 men. You're going to come down here. You're going to slaughter all of us. You're going to take his sheep. Listen, what's that going to prove? She basically says to David, I understand you're angry. Maybe you got a right to be angry, but here's the deal. You're wasting all this time, wasting all this energy on something so foolish. Now, none of you have ever done that, right? But we've done that in our home from time to time. I mean, not for a long, long time, but when we first got married, sometimes we had evangelically ticked off discussions, right, with one another. And Kelly and I might get into one of those discussions. And by the way, I'm so thankful for my bride. Every time we get in an argument, she comes to me on her hands and knees later on. And she says, you can come out from underneath the bed now. You don't have to hide anymore. Just get on out here. But in some of those discussions, there are moments, I can remember them, moments where it was like you wanted to just stop and say, this is really stupid. Like, we're arguing over this? I mean, if we're going to argue, let's at least have it really out. I mean, let's at least have something worth arguing about. You know what I'm saying? None of you have done that? Okay. Me neither. Heard a story about it somewhere and thought I'd claim it as my own. Sometimes we get in these foolish situations and we're like, really? This is really what we want to fight about? Essentially, that's what Abigail says to David. You really going to waste your time on this fella? You really going to worry about what he's doing? You really going to spend your time consumed in anger over this worthless fella, this fool? Verse 26, now then, my Lord, as the Lord lives and as your soul lives, because the Lord has restrained you from blood guilt and from saving with your own hand, now then let your enemies and those who seek to do evil to my Lord be as Nabal. After she told David that Nabal wasn't worth the trouble, she then essentially says to him, somebody in this situation's got to be wise. David, you can go down here. You can win this war. David, you can go down here and you can conquer Nabal. He's not got an army. You got 400 men right here. You got 200 back there that are watching your stuff and your belongings to make sure nobody raids against them. David, you can win this war. But is that really what you want to do? Do you really want to go down this trouble? Do you really want to be so angry about this troublesome person? David wanted to compound the folly of Nabal with his anger. He was going to kill a man over a few sheep, which weren't even his to begin with. Stop and just step back from this. David gets a pass. But these aren't David's sheep. I mean, unless David was Bernie Sanders, he has no rightful claim to these things, right? I mean, yeah, he can ask for them all he wants, but they're not his. Nabal had, some of you are just starting to think about that, and I can hear the groans, right? Listen, Nabal had every right to say no. And David could be mad all he wants about it, but he's going to compound one problem with the next. He's going to go steal the sheep, and all that's going to prove as he kills Nabal is that he's not the man after God's own heart as he'd been predicted to be. You know, when I was in high school, I worked at Walgreens, and I've told some portions of various stories from that time, and I was thinking about one of these in preparation this week. At the time that I worked at Walgreens, I don't know what their policy is today, but at the time their policy was that they were open 365 days a year. They never closed. They were the only, at that time, some 25 years ago, they were the only store, a retail store that was open 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. There was never a closing time, right? So what we would do as employees was we would split the time on the holidays. They would send out a list, and you could choose to sign up, and if you didn't sign up, then you would be given whatever was left over. And the manager happened to like me, and so I said, well, I would like to work Thanksgiving morning. Now, most people don't want to do that, but I was going to be off by 1. I was going to still have Thanksgiving lunch, see all the family, so on and so forth. And because I would work Thanksgiving morning, guess what? I wouldn't have to worry about Christmas. I would have it off. So it seemed like a good plan, and I volunteered to do that, and so that's what it was granted to me, and I thought I had selected pretty well. I showed up Thanksgiving morning at my allotted time, and I was glad to do it. Everything was really quiet in the store. We were doing facing, where you bring the product forward, and it makes the store look better than it really is, and just kind of walking around talking with other employees because nobody is coming in. In fact, it makes you think, who thinks this is a wise idea? Having a store open and nobody's coming in and spending money. You're just spending money as an employer having these people here, right? So we're there and everything's quiet, everything's going well, having a few jokes, and suddenly a lady comes into the store in obvious distress. She had a prescription that needed to be filled. The only problem is that while the store was open 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, the pharmacy was not. Even though the rest of the retail was open, the pharmacy itself was not. So she comes in and she's got a prescription that needs to be filled, and she says to me, "Why isn't your pharmacy open?" Now, never mind the fact that she had had the prescription for over a week and chosen not to fulfill it until Thanksgiving morning. This was my problem, right? It reminded me of my basketball coach who would always say, "Your lack of preparation does not demand my emergency," right? I wanted to say that to her, but it turns out you're not supposed to do that when you're working in retail. So anyway, she explains to me that this is a real crisis, that her prescription needs to be filled. And I explained to her politely, "I'm sorry, ma'am, but the pharmacy is closed. It'll be back open tomorrow morning." She explained to me that this is life and death. She's got to get a prescription. I said, "Ma'am, if it's truly life and death, you can go down to the hospital and they will fill your prescription for you. In fact, you don't even have to pay for it because they will give you just a couple of days and then you can come right back tomorrow and get the prescription here." She didn't like that answer. So she continued to demand, "What are you going to do about this?" And I said, "I can't do anything." I don't know if she thought that I was going to open the pharmacy for her and pass out drugs. Turns out that's another bad way to get fired at a pharmacy, right? I said, "I don't know what you want me to do. I don't know how you want me to help you, ma'am. I really just can't do anything for you. Can you call a pharmacist?" "I can, but they're not going to answer." "Well, if you call them and they answer, what are you going to tell them?" "I'm going to tell them there's a crazy lady here trying to get in the pharmacy." I said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry." In the most polite way I knew how. "Ma'am, I'm sorry. There's nothing I can do for you." As we continued to spat, she just got louder and louder and louder. I remember the time when I was at youth camp as a counselor, and one of the pastors who was there, he was a former drill sergeant. They make great pastors, by the way, let me tell you, right? And he says, "I learned a trick." And he was trying to teach a lesson about being a counselor at youth camp. And he said, the louder they would get in the army, when I was doing drills, he said, the louder the soldier would get, the softer my voice would get. And I found out that the softer I spoke, all of a sudden they brought their voices down with me as well. So I thought, here's a good opportunity to give this a try, right? She's yelling and screaming and carrying on, and I just kept getting my voice softer and softer and trying to say, "Ma'am, I wish I could do something for you. Listen, I believe it too. Walgreens is a terrible corporation. How could they close their pharmacy on Thanksgiving morning? How could they have not known that you were going to procrastinate for 5 days to bring this prescription in? Ma'am, I am really sorry. There's nothing I can do." And finally, after that last polite interlude, she was so angry, you could see the veins popping out of her forehead. Didn't see that again until after I got married. The veins popping out of her forehead, chomping at her gum in her mouth. And she reached into her mouth and she pulled her gum out and she threw it at me. And she stomped out the door. Now, I didn't know even really at that time, how do you respond to that? Like, do you chase them? Do you celebrate? Do you give God glory and praise that they're just out of the store? What do you do, right? Do you call a manager? Do you pick up the gum? Better yet, do you find somebody else to pick up the gum because you're a germphobe? Absolutely, right? Point being, it was so foolish. She could literally drive 3 blocks. It would cost her less than the time it took her to yell and scream at me to get the prescription filled. But in our human condition, this is what we do. We get angry over the dumbest of things. It's a microcosm of our world. We want what we want, and we want it now. And when we don't get what we want, we are willing to throw all common sense to the overboard and react in rage. That was David's response. "I want those sheep. You don't want to give them to me? I don't care if I have a right to them. I'm going to come and take them by force." Abigail's discernment wasn't just how she covered for Nabal. Listen, it was even how she covered for David. She protected a man from committing murder that day over something as silly. She protected a man from doing the unthinkable over something as silly as refusing to give him a meal. I want you to think about that the next time you ask the preacher to come out for lunch and you don't offer to pay. She even prayed for David in verse 29. If men rise up, she prayed, to pursue you and to seek your life, the life of my Lord. I love this prayer. I've underlined it in my Bible. I've been praying it for a few weeks. The life of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of the living in the care of the Lord your God. Boy, I hope somebody's praying that prayer over me. I'm praying it over my family. No matter what happens, would your lives be bound up in the bundle of the living of the Lord? In other words, Abigail said, David, this is such a foolish fight. You're about to commit an unthinkable act of murder against a man because he didn't provide you a meal. Let it go and let God be your protector from this point forward. Verse 30 and 31, I'm almost done. When the Lord has done to my Lord according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you and has appointed you prince over Israel, my Lord shall have no cause of grief or pangs of conscience for having shed blood without cause, or for my Lord working salvation for himself. That last phrase meaning taking vengeance upon yourself. In simple terms, Abigail said to David, David, let your anger go down. Let your anger go down. One day, this isn't going to matter at all. And in that moment, what she did, she protected Nabal, but she protected David from his own self. And the writer says she protected David from his conscience. She said, you may not have this today, but one day you're going to be sitting on a throne in Israel, and your conscience is going to start bothering you about what you did to Nabal for no reason. I don't want that. Please, I'm begging you, let your anger go down. Now, I got to hurry. The story has a humorous Hollywood ending. David lets his anger subside, basically says, boy, this is quite a woman, just short of the Hebrew saying hubba hubba. And he says, go on home, right? And he lets his anger begin to subside a little bit. Y'all know what hubba hubba means? All right, good. Nabal is, when Abigail goes home, what she finds is Nabal, the fool. Are you ready? He's throwing a feast for himself. Now, is this not the epitome of irony? Nabal came this close to being killed. And when Abigail comes home after having saved him, Nabal is at home throwing a feast for himself. And listen, and he's drunk. Time for a little bit more discernment, right? Time for a little more discernment on Abigail's part. Abigail walks in and she sees this drunk guy. And if it had been me, I'd have just grabbed David's sword and killed him my own self. But Abigail walks up and she goes, you know what? Ain't no point in talking about this tonight. I'll let it go till the morning. Next morning, Nabal gets up. And I like how the scripture says, and the wine had gone out of him. I'll let you figure out exactly what that means. But the wine has gone out of Nabal, and Abigail rolls over in bed and says, I got a story to tell you, buddy. Listen, you have no idea what just happened. In verse 37, having heard the story, the Bible says that Abigail, listen to this, that Abigail tells him the story, and Nabal becomes like stone. Can you imagine the moment? Hey, dude, listen, you missed something. While you were sleeping, while you were down there drinking and having a feast, let me tell you something. I saved your life. I saved our family. I saved the servants. I saved our sheep. I saved our wealth because I went and did what you wouldn't do. Not only that, but that dude over there, he's got 400 soldiers. And they was coming down here to kill us, and I stopped it. And Nabal, having heard that, went, oh boy, and just became like a stone. The Bible goes on to say 10 days later that he died by the hand of the Lord. What David had wanted to do, listen, the Lord did for him. Sometimes, beloved, it is best if we leave our battles to the Lord to fight. Remember one of our first ministry experiences, my wife and I left the church, and we were I thought we were really, really beloved in the church in our time there, and just thankful for the experience and all of those things. And everybody, I think, going into it, knew it wasn't going to be a long-term thing, but everybody, I think, felt blessed. And then as the days turned into weeks and even in months, all of a sudden you start hearing things like, well, Chris is this and Chris is that, and Chris didn't do this and Chris didn't do that. And the list kind of went on, and maybe you should have heard some of those things. You might not have brought me to Cornerstone. But anyway, all of a sudden, it kind of started getting a little ugly, even though we were gone. And I remember Kelly looked at me one day and she was like, what are you going to do? You're going to make some calls? You're going to talk to some folks and tell them that they need to straighten up and they need to understand the truth? And I said, no. We're just going to not respond at all. We're just going to let the Lord fight our battle because the truth always makes its way out. Turns out that the individual, no, I'm not going to tell that. David hears about Nabal's untimely demise. Listen, because the Lord fought his battle for him. And listen to what happens next. He sends for Abigail and he marries her. And everything worked out in the end. Unless you're Nabal, of course, right? God has a marvelous way of working things out in a way better than we ever can. A couple of applications this morning, I'll be done. Let me move from the specific and work our way out to the general. First of all, Abigail is a beautiful picture of patience, wisdom, and the discernment of a woman. Often not treated as equal heirs of the riches of Christ. I want you to listen to me closely, ladies. Abigail shows that God knew what he was doing when he created woman in all of her splendor. Men, we're often like Nabal, selfish and stupid. We oftentimes, when we're not like Nabal, we tend to be like David. Passionate, easy stirred to anger, ready to roar at the smallest of slights. But God knew what man needed when he created a woman. When he gave us our beautiful bride, we should not despise that, men, but embrace God's help through our helpmate. God knew exactly what he was creating when he created the woman. To be clear, we believe that men and women here at Cornerstone Baptist Church were created equal in the sight of God. We believe that we're all joint heirs with Christ in the riches of the kingdom. That we're all gifted and called according to his great purposes. Now, when I say that, I'm not suggesting that there are not God-appointed roles and responsibilities that are unique to each gender. In fact, I think that's the problem in part of our world, in part of the discussion today. You see, we think that equality means that we're all doing the same thing, but that actually minimizes the beauty of how God created us. Men are to be physical, emotional, and spiritual leaders of our home, and when we fail to do that, listen, the whole family structure suffers. We're supposed to be spiritual leaders in our community. We're supposed to be physical, emotional, and spiritual leaders in our church. Wives, we're told, are submit to the authority of the husband as they submit to the authority of Christ. But we should not in this moment confuse roles with giftedness or uniqueness. Though my bride, my precious bride today, functions in a different role in our home than I do, she is an irreplaceable part of the function of the home, the church, and our society as a whole. God knew exactly what he was doing when he created a woman. Ladies, we need more Abigails. Women who don't care about prestige and power, who don't want to be the president of the Southern Baptist Convention or the pastor of the church, but just want to serve as God called them to serve. Abigail was willing to take the blame for Nabal's sin. Women who in grace and beauty discern the right, stand confidently, boldly lead in the stillness. Regardless of whether or not anybody ever hears their story, with no regard for public recognition, but are willing to lead in the stillness, in beauty and in grace and discernment to a better world. You have the opportunity, ladies, to help your spouse. You have the opportunity to protect us from ourselves. Now, maybe your husbands don't need that, but my wife's does. We need protection from our own selves. It doesn't matter if the world knows your name. Abigail saved countless servants that day in her discernment and her actions. That leads me to a more general application. I wish we could all attain the discernment of Abigail. Man, woman, boy, girl, child, young, old, I wish we could all attain her type of discernment. Discernment's a really lost art in today's world. We react foolishly, oftentimes without delay. Often we don't ask questions to get to the underlying problems. We react quickly, not letting time heal our anger. We lash out when we think we've been wronged or been offended by somebody. Wisdom has hidden her face. When I read Abigail's story anew a few weeks ago, I asked God to give me her wisdom, give me her discernment. Help me to look at the world as Abigail looked at the world. Abigail's beauty grew from her inner self to her outer self. Ever notice how ugly a person seems when they're ugly on the inside? Ever notice how no matter what they look like on the outside, what clothes they wear, what car they drive, what house they live in, when they're ugly on the inside, when they're not beautiful in their soul, listen, it bleeds out to their outer person. Abigail's beauty was deeply rooted in her soul, and it just shined out in her appearance. It just showed up. We need that kind of beauty in our world today. We need that kind of beauty in a world full of ugly. We need more of her discernment. More of her grace, more of her patience. One last thought. Abigail's actions saved a future king from what could have been a nightmare. God might have refused to allow David to become king if he'd murdered Nabal. He punished Saul for what one might say is a lesser offense. God punishes David later on in his life in the years to come. How might David's story have been completely different if Abigail had not interceded on that day and said, stop what you're doing, let your anger calm down, and let's stop and be rational and reasonable. Yes, you've been wrong, but get over it. It's not worth it. He's a foolish man. Don't do this. How would the people have looked at David in the years to come if he were king? Maybe he did get everything he wanted. Maybe he conquered Nabal. Maybe he got his lands. Maybe he got his properties. Maybe he became the king of Israel. But how would the people feel when they found out that the way in which he did it was the first act was killing a man because he wouldn't give him a meal? Listen, they would have lost respect for him. The funny thing about discernment is that few ever really know its full value because few ever really see its full effect. Abigail saved David a world of trouble on his way to the throne. And the crowds, listen, on his inauguration day didn't go, Abigail, Abigail, Abigail. Nobody even knew about it. Beloved, this morning the choices you and I make, they're like a tiny pebble cast upon a calm pond on a morning in the summer. Sometimes they make an initial splash, but the ripples spread out to the borders. Our ability to be a discerning and wise people and a decision born out of that discernment, listen, it will spread out to our borders. Lord, give me Abigail's discernment and beauty this morning and give it to the people I serve.